When it comes to builds in Path of Exile, the most popular thing isn't always necessarily the strongest. I find the meta can often take a couple of leagues to catch up with what the top players are doing. And this is because many of the top players in Path of Exile aren't content creators. They don't stream. In fact, many of them might have a private profile. So if the build isn't showcased, it can be incredibly powerful and fly under the radar for a little bit. But no secret is kept forever. And the harder you try to keep that secret, the more likely it will get out. And so today I'm going to be talking about 5 builds that in 3.18 were incredibly underrated and are all very good. Some of them are appropriate for league start. Others are more of something you switch to once you're in endgame. But all of them are very good at tackling the content that Path of Exile has to offer. The first of which is Shield Crush, a skill that was added in 3.15. And I know that people like to meme and say, oh, but melee's dead. Realistically, we've seen a pretty high amount of melee play in the recent leagues. Cyclone is played quite a lot, even as a damage skill. Bone Shatter is quietly exploding the screen, especially in solo self-found hardcore. And of course, Lightning Strike is a build that's so popular, I think people might have forgot to consider it melee. Don't worry, the skill itself also forgets that it's melee sometimes. And Shield Crush is another underrated melee gem. It's quite good at clearing maps, especially if you have a little bit of area scaling or an explodey effect. And it's not bad at single target either. One thing I would advise against is playing Shield Crush with General's Cry. General's Cry adds a lot of needless complication to your build, and that level of clunkiness just isn't worth it for what's ultimately going to be mediocre damage. But even if you don't go with the General's Cry version, there are still several options. So let's look into some of them today. The first of which is absolutely the weirdest, an elemental crit Shield Crush Inquisitor. I don't think this is something I'd really advise to most people. It leverages a lot of really tricky mechanics, and will probably be difficult to put together without a Mage Blood. One could even argue that it would be a better build if it was wearing a Headhunter, since converting Shield Crush is the perfect skill to scale off of all the fizzes extra that Headhunter gives. But of course, we're an Inquisitor. And one thing that Inquisitor is very good at is recovery. So we've got Pious Path and all the good stuff there. We are of course using Iron Will since we have a decent amount of strength, and you might as well add that to your spell damage. With Crown of Eyes, the spell damage becomes attack damage. Seething Fury is required to go crit Shield Crush. That's what enables your shield to crit basically. And as a result, we're going to be using an Evasion Energy Shield or Armor Energy Shield hybrid. You need the Energy Shield to build up your crit chance, and you need the evasion or armor for your base damage. For a weapon, we're going with a rather expensive stat stick that's got fizzes extra and spell damage. Remember, spell damage is being converted over to generic attack damage. On crit, we're ignoring resistances, so we don't need to worry about penetration, and it doesn't matter if we're dealing mixed elemental damage. From there, it's just about hitting as hard as we can. I'm a little bit surprised about the hypothermia support. I'm not 100% sold on that, because yes, you can chill enemies with Frostblink, but what if you don't Frostblink onto a boss? And so I do think there's some things about this build that I'd change before playing it personally. Nevertheless, it's an interesting idea, and Hatred does give a lot of damage, so I would assume this is a pretty smooth way to clear your maps. We've got no elemental focus, so we're probably freezing and shattering most enemies. But out of all the options here, I do think this is the one that's most likely to get hit by, well, multiple nerfs coming into 3.19. It's entirely possible that some of the mechanics here won't work quite the same as they do now, especially given that Inquisitor is one of the most played ascendancies. So let's move on to something a little bit more traditional. And by more traditional, I mean completely non-traditional. If anything, this build is a statement of how bad Bleed is currently, because this is a Poison Shield Crush Slayer. For a long time, Poison has been the underrated dot ascendancy. And again, I don't think this is the version you'll be league starting. That's coming up next, or maybe you could go with a Bleed Gladiator version. The reason I wanted to talk about it is it's doing a lot of really interesting stuff. Snakebite of course scales incredibly well if you have a bunch of frenzy charges. And Slayer is of course very good at stacking frenzy charges to get endurance charges, which means this should feel super tanky. We don't have any armor, but I bet physical mitigation on this is on par with a lot of builds with 40 or 50,000 armor. And defensively, this is no slouch. We aren't going the leech route, which makes sense. As a poison build, we're simply not going to be hitting hard enough to actually be leeching anything meaningful. However, we've got spell suppression, we've got block via versatile combatant, and we've got ghost stance. You can pretty safely ignore the point blank here, as I guarantee that's just being converted over into Corrupted Soul for the glorious vanity. I'm slightly surprised to not see the Maven belt here, Alyssa's Delight. This would give a massive amount of damage over time from all the frenzy charges we're stacking. But maybe the build felt good enough that it was better to go for life, as right now at 5.3k, we're probably not super squishy, but we're also not super tanky either. And I could see why going down in life by probably 800-900 from losing the belt would actually have a meaningful impact. If you're planning to do this on League Start, well, don't. Go for a Bleed Shield Crush Slayer or Bleed Shield Crush Gladiator instead. But it's interesting to me to see the way the Ascendancy is being leveraged here, since Slayer does offer a very large generic amount of damage, along with a decent bit of attack speed, both of which synergize incredibly well with Shield Crush and Poison. I especially like the use of the Impact node. Not only is this making it easier to cap accuracy, but it's getting the AoE that Shield Crush loves. I'm guessing we don't have a Pulverize support, which is a concession being made for not running a hit-based version. And if you were wondering how many endurance charges do we have, well, the endurance charge on melee stun is proof that there's quite a lot of them here. Though, as this is a Deadly Ailments build, I don't think we're actually stunning that often, it's just for the bonus damage in combination with a replica Feral's Fur. And then finally, the Vanilla Shield Crush Slayer Chad. This is a very strong build, and very easy to put together on League Start. All you really need is a Prismatic Eclipse, and you might want to add a Crown of the Inward Eye and Rizlatha's Coil. None of these are particularly expensive uniques most of the time. From there, of course, you can continue to scale it, and it's good enough to do most if not all of the endgame. We're now going for Slayer Leech, so this will feel really good to play. We've got Unwavering for stun immunity, Iron Reflexes for tons of armor, and Versatile Combatant again for block. I'm guessing there's no spell suppression here, but if you wanted to switch around your gearing a bit, you could absolutely do that as well. For hit-based Shield Crush, I very strongly suggest getting the gem level to 24. This will enable the proper scaling, and as you can see we've got +1 here on the amulet, +2 on the chest, and a level 21 gem, so we are getting to level 24 for the additional scaling from our shield. This can be played a variety of ways. You can go Resolute Technique, really easy to do off League Start. You could also go Precise Technique for 40% more damage, and that'll take you a little bit further. Or, if you want, you could go full hit or full crit and continue to scale Impale, or maybe even convert over to cold damage. Personally, I find Shield Crush to be a very versatile skill, and I've played it a couple times now. I played a crit Shield Crush Gladiator back in 3.15, and then during Endless Heist I played a Bleed Shield Crush Slayer, and I had a good time with both of them. So if you're looking for a melee build to play that should feel really good on a League Start and is relatively easy to scale, I suggest looking into Shield Crush for 3.19. One of the reasons that it's so easy to scale is you don't have to worry about rolling a good weapon. While everyone else is trying to roll a weapon early on, all you need is a shield. And those tend to be a lot less expensive. Though do be warned, things like the Sinistral Gloves are a little bit niche and might be slightly harder to find. Next up, we've got Explosive Trap. I know that Seismic Trap is probably going to get nerfed, and may in fact be completely obliterated. So instead, maybe you'll want to use something like Explosive Trap, Seismic's little brother who actually does a respectable amount of damage. And there's several ways to play this. You can either go with a pure fire conversion, or you can go with a fire-cold conversion. Now, for a main hand weapon, Secrets of Suffering enables quite a lot of damage here. I think personally I'd rather Leadership's Price, but I can also see the value of something like a Crit Multi Fizz Skill Gem Amulet. In terms of a chest piece, we're looking for things like Spell Crit, Life, and Spell Suppression. This build is a Saboteur, so in a lot of ways it's going to struggle for defenses if you aren't really careful about getting your Suppress up as soon as possible. One thing that I notice about a lot of these setups, which I do think you should be careful of, they tend to be a little bit greedy. This is because if you want to go for full conversion, it's not the easiest thing to do on Explosive Trap. For example, here, we're going all the way over to Avatar Fire. So if you play it for yourself, maybe look into how you could solve that without going so far over, out of your way, and through a lot of nodes that honestly have some questionable value. Though I guess Life and Armor Mastery is never terrible. Now, one thing I will warn you, Explosive Trap can be painful on the eyes. So it's maybe not the perfect alternative to Seismic, but let's be honest, at least you'll be able to see most of the screen. And it should leverage all the things that make Saboteur good already. After all, it's a base Fizz skill, so there's a lot of opportunities for conversion or Fizz's extra. It tends to overlap and shotgun, though I'm not too sure of the mechanics for myself. I'd have to look into that a little bit. I haven't played Explosive Trap really ever as an endgame skill, and last time I played it, it was more just a leveling experience. But now let's look at something a little bit different. Let's look at a much tankier version. This is a CI Explosive Trap build that is leveraging Incandescent Heart. Remember, gaining Elemental as extra chaos, if you're able to convert without Avatar Fire, gives you a nice juicy extra bonus. 25% of elemental damage from hits taken as chaos. If your CI is 25% less elemental damage taken. Of course, this setup is probably going to get nerfed. This is the most overpowered shield in the game, and I don't really see it surviving. But you could go with an ES on block shield instead. You'd have to pay close attention to your armor. We're already using Crown of the Inward Eye and Saintly Chainmail though, and both of those are ES armor bases, so I don't think it would matter too much. You'd probably just want to switch from a full ES glove to an ES armor base and have the full ES be over on your shield. If anything, that should result in slightly higher ES and slightly lower armor. Something else I like here is we're now leveraging Taste of Hate. Taste of Hate is great because Fizz taken as cold means that cold damage is now being applied to your resistances and your armor's even more effective. Now, Melting of the Flesh is something else that could easily be nerfed, so again, trying to copy this setup one for one might not go that well for you. But if you're looking for a fairly tanky version of Explosive Trap that can be min-maxed into the endgame and take more hits than your standard Saboteur, I think this could be a very good choice for bossing and even uber bossing in 3.19, assuming enough of the underlying mechanics survive. And while I did call out 2 specifically, I think the rest could be okay, and you'll be able to get by with alternatives, such as maybe not using an Incandescent Heart. Maybe instead you'll use Brass Dome, and maybe you'll have an ES on Block Shield. But we'll have to wait for patch notes to know more about that one. Then finally, I wanted to showcase one other option for Explosive Trap. Again, this does lean fairly heavily into damage. I think this build would probably be better served by holding a shield, since it's got so much. Remember, that's 3.8 million per explosion, and multiple explosions overlap. But Crystallized Omniscience is incredibly powerful, and of course you can leverage it on Explosive Trap. We've got a Brass Dome here, and we've got some nice spell suppression. Again, spell suppression is going to be very, very important for a build like this. We've got relatively low life, and also relatively low recovery. So you're not going to be able to super tank things or face tank things, but this will do a lot of damage. This is deleting uber bosses in seconds. If you played Seismic Trapper and you wanted that feel and you're not worried about the fact that you might die a little bit while mapping, then this is probably the thing to do. Now, unfortunately, the clear might not be quite as smooth as Seismic Trap, though I do think there are alternatives where you could put something like an Exsanguinate Trap in and have decent clear still. But if you're wondering what sort of Trapper could you play in 3.19 that'll feel a lot like the current Seismic Traps, again, assuming that Trappers themselves don't get gutted, I'd say Explosive Trap is your next best bet. And after that, possibly Lightning or Flamethrower, but we'll have to see if Flamethrower and Fire Trap get some sort of adjustment as a result of their use in Righteous Fire builds. Now, third up, we have Deathwish. Deathwish is a rather unique minion Ignite build, where your Ignite is essentially based off of your minion's health. The reason this is so powerful is you can scale minion health pretty high, to the point where you will be able to inflict massive Ignites. It's also very nice because you don't need a 6th link. You just need a unique helmet that, while it might be a bit of a pain in SSF, is actually fairly easy to farm in trade. So to start off with, this is the life-based version of a build that I've seen a lot of people play. Ashes is used both defensively and for damage. Skin of the Lords is used to bump up your minion gems by a couple levels pretty much for free. And, well, if you're seeing a lot of Aegis, that's because Aegis is really good. But you don't necessarily need all of these things. I do think that a life-based version of this build will be a little bit squishier, especially if you're undergeared, and you're going to have to play a little bit better as a result. However, the other advantage is you only have to really channel your Deathwish once every 5 or 6 seconds. For the rest of the time, you can just focus on dodging enemy abilities. So if you have a good shield, something which, let's just say, gives you life, and maybe you don't go for Polaric Devastation when you're undergeared, and you instead go with just a regular old Rare Ring, you should be in a pretty good spot. After all, Polaric Devastation is nice for damage, but definitely not required. A friend of mine, by the name of Epic Builds, has significantly explored this archetype, and if you want to see his experiences playing it, then check out his channel down in the description below. Valor Mage also played the build in SSF, and so if you want to see it on super budget gear, that will also be down below. For now though, let's look at what I think is the better version, or at the very least is my favorite. That is a CI version. More and more, I found that CI just kind of makes sense for Witch. You're able to get a lot of value here since so many of the ES nodes are right along the way for things you're pathing to anyway. You already want aura stuff. You already want fire stuff since you are an Ignite build despite the interesting scaling. And of course, you can leverage Incandescent Heart since as an Elementalist, all damage ignites, therefore your chaos damage ignites. And that's just a massive multiplier. I think this is a much better and more approachable early league build if you don't have things like a Mage Blood. After all, there's no Ashes of the Stars, and it should have enough damage to be totally fine. I know again, we are using the one god shield that probably won't exist, but it is replaceable. Again, a solid ES on block shield will be more than enough to carry you into endgame. It won't be quite as good. It'll be a lot harder to fit in melding, but it's at least playable. When it comes to Deathwish Ignite, something else to note is your scaling doesn't really work the way a lot of other builds do. A lot of other builds, when you think of scaling, you just think of gem levels. But remember, this is minion health scaling. So on a normal Ignite build, you could do something like increased fire damage or increased damage over time, and they'd scale the same way. In this case, however, increased minion life stacks with all other increases and reductions to minion life, but will multiply with your increased fire damage. You're increasing the health of the golem, which you then blow up, to deal the damage that inflicts the ignite. And so in that regard, there's actually a lot of interesting scaling options here. This is the sort of build where you will have to be careful. It's far too easy to go all in on minion life. I want, 600,000 life on each golem. And then you realize that you don't have things like ignite deals damage faster, damage over time multiplier, or increased fire damage. Similarly, it can also be problematic if you go too far the other way. You get damage over time multiplier. Ignite deals damage faster and increased fire damage, but you don't have enough minion life. This is especially true if you're using the Incandescent Heart version. Remember, you lose out on 2 levels of your gems, which translates to more than 2 levels on your minion, since you have the Stone Golem that's gaining 2 levels, and also you have the Empower support that's gaining 2 levels. So while this is a version that has less overall damage, it's far stronger defensively, and it should feel better in terms of quality of life. One other tip. Herald of Purity is not there because you want the effect of the aura. Herald of Purity is there to add additional quality of life while mapping. If you don't use Herald of Purity, you'll have to summon skeletons. And when you summon skeletons, you get to blow them all up. This is because the more minions that are affected by your Deathwish, the higher the multiplier on the damage. Herald of Purity, on the other hand, does cost you some mana, so it's not a perfect solution here. But it has the advantage of automatically generating minions for you, so you can blow up those instead of having to just blow up your golems. It also means that your minions kind of refresh themselves as you kill, so while you're going through a map, this will lead to a much smoother experience. If you're primarily bossing, I would go with the Summon Skeletons route, but if you're primarily mapping, I would go Herald of Purity. One last note. The one expensive item that you're probably going to need for this build early on is Barracks Respite. It's a fairly uncommon unique, but it is absolutely incredibly worth it. The fire damage to spells and attacks won't really matter. Remember, you're blowing up minions with massive health pools, so flat added damage doesn't really matter or impact this build. But when you kill a shocked enemy, inflict an equivalent shock on each nearby enemy, and when you kill an ignited enemy, inflict an equivalent ignite on each nearby enemy. This means that you'll have super fast clear, and because you're an elementalist, all damage can shock, all damage can ignite, so you'll be getting big juicy shocks and big juicy ignites. It's a little janky, and does take some getting used to, but if you hate minions, and you're looking for a really solid league starter in 3.19, then maybe consider playing Deathwish Ignite. I think this is actually the one most underrated build in Path of Exile 3.18. I know it's kind of at the midway point, and I probably should have saved it to the end, but hey, here you have it. This is the good stuff, and every build after this isn't going to be quite as good. But if you've been enjoying the video, maybe you found some things to try for your 3.19 League start practice, then be sure to leave a like, and let me know down in the comments which build you found to be the most helpful. For more content, either on Path of Exile or other games, get subscribed and ring that notification bell. If you want to watch something after this, you could also check out my second channel, 10 Gaming Thoughts, where I go over gaming news and review a lot of indie titles. A special thanks to my patrons and YouTube channel members for the continued support that allows me to make videos just like this one, but more about how you can help at the end of a video. For now, let's get to those last two promised builds. The first of which is an actual honest-to-goodness true minion build. That's right, we've got Summon Holy Relic. There's a very good chance that skeleton mages will not be surviving the 3.19 patch notes. And if you want something that's a nice alternative, personally, I suggest Summon Holy Relic. It's the kind of minion that's definitely gone under the radar for a very long time. And this is probably because it's not as flashy as alternatives, but it is incredibly strong. Summon Holy Relic automatically gives you defensive benefits because its Nova skill grants life regeneration to allies. It also grants life regeneration to minions. Though do be warned, you have to be meleeing for this to work, which is why on all Summon Holy Relic setups, you'll see Cyclone with something like Cast While Channeling Desecrate and your Bone Offering. Cast While Channeling might not be great for dealing damage, but it's pretty good for consistently triggering something. We've also got Support Spectres and of course an Animate Guardian. Joffrey's Crest is the one item here that's very important. Getting the Summon Holy Relics have 20% increased cooldown recovery rate is essentially Summon Holy Relics have 20% more damage, since there are very few sources of minion cooldown recovery rate. +1 to maximum Summon Holy Relics is also very important for the build. This won't be quite as good at speed clearing as something like a Skeletal Mage build. It'll feel a little bit closer to Skeletal Melee in that regard. But you also don't have to constantly be resummoning your minions. The Holy Relics are themselves persistent minions. You're able to leverage all the good juicy defensive mechanics that Necromancer loves. You can get into things' faces and not really worry about it too much. And of course, because you're already channeling an offering, adding Bone Offering for that block should make your relics pretty much immortal. Because they tend to be triggered by melee, they also do a much better job of actually following you closely and not getting lost running off into mechanics. I'm not a huge fan of minion builds personally, but if I had to play a minion build, it probably would be a Summon Holy Relic build. It's a good combination of quality of life, since we're able to use Cyclone, with very respectable damage, both for single target and clear. You'll probably clear about the same speed as any other Cyclone-based build. Now, if you want an alternative, you could also use something like this, which is a CI version that's running Skin of the Lords. Overall, this version, once min-maxed, will probably be both more damage and tankier. Again, remember you can drop this for an ES on Block Shield. I know I've said that a lot, and I'm probably going to have to keep saying it. Maybe you don't want Skin of the Lords. You could also use Incandescent Heart, since that's even more defenses, especially against elemental damage, and might make up for the fact that it's a bit harder to cap out your Melding of the Flesh if you don't have 5% on your shield. But if you're looking at a league start, you can probably get a Skin of a Loyal or Skin of a Lords with pretty much any old mods, as long as it has the right colors. From there you can grab a Joffrey's, and you're good to go. One other thing to consider is, if you're not using Melding, I suggest dropping Commander of Darkness and instead taking Essence Skeleton. What Essence Skeleton will do is allow you to have a lot more recovery at the cost of a little bit less res. But if you're not using Melding, you probably won't necessarily need the res as much anyway. Out of all the builds I've talked about so far, I think this and the Shield Crush are by far the most beginner-friendly. So if you're new to Path of Exile and looking for something to practice for 3.19, go with one of those. Finally, last but not least, Venom Gyre. Venom Gyre is very similar to Spectral Helix, in that it doesn't do all that much by itself, but it's a great vehicle for damage delivery. Right now, I think that Venom Gyre is overshadowed by Spectral Helix, because Spectral Helix has much more impressive numbers in PoB. And in fact, the damage numbers on Venom Gyre are never going to be super impressive. However, it attacks very quickly and feels very good to play. This is the definition of a skill with excellent mechanics. And since, in and of itself, it's just a vehicle for damage delivery, there's several ways in which you can play it. The first is, of course, the Crystallized Omniscience route. This is the route that is most likely going to get nerfed. It leverages Nightblade, it leverages Trinity, and it leverages Omni. You're going to have quite a bit of damage by using a Tri-Ellie Claw, because Venom Gyre fires out a massive number of projectiles, and those projectiles return, thus, if I understand correctly, being able to hit enemies twice. There's a good chance you'll get an absurd amount of recovery, and if you play it on a Deadeye, you get lots of free damage from Mantra of Flames. That's a little bit similar to Spectral Helix, without actually being Spectral Helix. I suggest something like this. But this isn't the only way to play the build. On the other hand, if you're starting with a high budget option, you could go with Replica Alberon's Warpath. The Ellie version is probably a lot more League Start friendly, but I could still see doing something like Ellie Spectral Helix into this if you're really set on it. Strength stacking is in a really good spot right now, and while the strength stacking boot mod is going away with Sentinel, Replica Alberon's Warpath should be alive and well. Your claw is basically just a stat stick, you want crit chance, crit multi, attack pen. Your tree is going to look like a complete weirdo made it, since the goal is to go as far as possible from the start. And if you look, we start here, and we go whoop, around, and I'm not sure why we're connecting here and here. I feel like there should be some sort of gap, like right here, to actually force the build to path all the way around. I'm going to assume that something was made here as a mistake, because if you're connecting like this, your pathing essentially goes like this, instead of your pathing going like this. Yeah, that's how trees tend to look if you're using split personality. Mage Bane is a really nice touch to get a little bit of suppression in. Since we're strength stacking, we want the Red Blade banner, and I really like the crit reduction on it. And of course, we're probably grabbing the Jug node. Yep, undeniable. Since the best part about Jug is undeniable, and if you can have it in a Berserker, all the better. The only thing I don't really like here is going up top for Blitz. Personally, I'd much rather invest in Rage, and I'd also much rather drop Aspect of Carnage. This build is going to do plenty of damage without those things, and your defenses will feel a lot more reliable if you're going for the other route. You could even take one node here, along with the Rage stuff, but I'd still probably go for Defiance. Defy Pain is a great node, and doesn't really get that much attention, since it doesn't show up with gigantic damage numbers in PoB. Now, this last way to play Venom Gyre is actually my favorite. I don't know that it's going to be surviving the 3.19 patch notes, but if it does, there's a very good chance I'll be trying this for myself. That is the deck stack version. Deck stacking has been, honestly, a very powerful and underrated way to get damage. It's often outshone by int stacking and strength stacking, which is a note. If you want to play a How a Venom Gyre build, that'll work totally fine as well, and it lets you leverage all the nice ES-based defenses. The nicest thing is actually something that this build isn't using, which is you can use a chess piece with attack speed per dexterity. That way you attack super fast and it feels absolutely amazing. Since we're back on a Deadeye, we can leverage things like Mantra of Flames, and of course, we get all the really nice Deadeye stuff from this part of a tree that lets us easily cap our suppression. I don't think the deck stacking Venom Gyre, or Venom Gyre in general, is the best build for a beginner. But if you're a veteran player looking for something really strong that should be able to scale pretty well into the endgame, this is absolutely something to consider. If you're comfortable in your mechanics and know when you're going to be able to dodge and not get hit, then the Deadeye version's probably pretty good. On the other hand, if you're not as comfortable in your skills, or maybe you even feel a little bit potato, I'd go with a Berserker instead. The Berserker will be able to leverage armor and should be able to take damage more consistently, rather than an evasion character that gets blown up if you make the wrong move. To be clear, I don't know how many of these builds are going to survive the 3.19 patch notes. But what I do know is, even if these builds don't survive in their current form, you should be able to learn something from them. Let's say deck stacking Venom Gyre's dead, but how a Venom Gyre becomes the most OP thing in 3.19, or maybe the most OP thing in 3.22. Alternatively, maybe Deathwish Ignite doesn't actually end up working that well, but Dark Pact Ignite ends up being incredible. A lot of these builds will leverage very similar mechanics, so once you learn the underlying mechanics and underlying interactions, you should be able to put something together for yourself that will function at least as well as, if not better than the original. So now I'm curious, what do you think the strongest underrated build in Path of Exile is? Is it Deathwish Ignite, or would you pick something else? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. A special thanks to my patrons and YouTube channel members. Your support helps keep me independent and allows me to turn down things like sketchy mobile game sponsorships. You can do so for as low as $1 a month over on Patreon, or if you want to support me completely for free, then you can join the community by hopping into my Discord, link below. If you want more content, check out my second channel, 10 Gaming Thoughts. It's a place that I use to review games, ramble my way through video essays, and a lot more. Or of course, you can just click the suggested video in the card right now. I hope you learned something today, and maybe I'll see you again sometime soon.